I'm Bowman Brown, and I'm chairman of the Shutts Bowen Executive Committee, as well as co-chair of the Financial Industry Practice Group. Well, our executive committee is pretty much equivalent to a board of directors, and I'm chairman of the board of directors, so to speak, for the firm. And we manage the firm overall in terms of policy and not day-to-day functions. We have managing partners for each of our offices and an overall managing partner for the entire firm to do the day-to-day administrative functions. Miami, as you know, has over the years really come along as an important international banking center, particularly for Latin America, but also for Europe and to some extent for Asia. And it's created a lot of good white-collar jobs. I think attracted a lot of business here because banking is important to almost every type of business, and also attracted a number of international private banking clients that want to have their assets managed by a sophisticated international bank. Well, yeah, I worked as an intern for the St. Petersburg Times, which at one point had the best training program, intern program in the country. The St. Petersburg Times was a not-for-profit, basically, which is unusual for a newspaper. It was owned by the Poynter Foundation, and so there weren't profit pressures. And they hired a bunch of interns, gave each intern a college scholarship, and every summer you would actually be a reporter on the beat. So I did the branch at one point, which was the full range of reporting functions for 2 years. I think I did sports 1 year and features for another year. I guess maybe features for a couple of years, but great experience, really. Well, I started as a corporate securities lawyer, given my MBA law background, and we had one small bank client at that point. Didn't use much in the way of legal services, and they had a few problems, corporate problems, proxy contests and so forth. So I got involved in that, and then they had some banking problems, and I was, familiar with the banks, and we got along well, so they asked me to help with those, and I sort of got into it that way and liked it, so I started basically looking for matters that came into the firm in the banking front, and wound up getting a lot of experience that way. And then I taught at the University of Miami Law School for a couple of years, which was a very good way to, you learn more when you teach than you actually teach, I think. So there are no materials, there were none then for banking courses, so I generated all my own materials. It was a good opportunity to stand back and look at banking on sort of a global basis, put the pieces together. So that was very helpful. And then the Florida's scene changed. Before 1978, banking law basically prohibited interstate branching, and there were a number of major banks trying to get into Florida because it's such a great market. And I helped some of those major banks move into the state. We didn't have any large local clients, local bank clients, so I was free to represent the out-of-state banks that wanted to come into the market. And we represented a number of money center banks like J.P. Morgan and Harris Trust Company, First National Bank of Chicago, Continental Illinois, a number of New York banks that wanted to set up here. So we were able to help U.S. Trust Company establish the first interstate office in Florida, and work to establish a lot of trust company subsidiaries for these other big banks. And we also did the first non-bank bank, which allowed banking basically on an interstate basis through a quirk, maybe a loophole, if you will, in the banking framework. So that was the sort of first really innovative, interesting project we had. And then in 1978, the Federal International Banking Act was adopted, and we worked with legislation and local lobby groups to get the Florida legislature to adopt an International Bank Act that allows foreign banks to set up here. So we had worked with Wall Street firms that represented these money center banks that wanted to come into the domestic money center banks that wanted to come into the domestic market. And they referred us their international bank clients to help them set up here in Florida. So we wound up involved in almost every international bank that, helping every international bank, and some domestic banks like Bank of America establish offices here to service the international market. And so we provide international banking legal services to most of the players in the industry at this point still. Well, I'd say at the beginning there was a rush to get in. Every couple of months there was a grand opening party for one of the big international banks or the other. Then it plateaued with most of the major players in the market. And then with the downturn, the Great Recession, and the advent of tougher regulatory oversight, the pressures and the cost pressures became extreme on banks to keep up. So we had a lot of departures. The risks of doing business measured against the reputational risk of a regulatory problem served as a real disincentive to a number of the big players in the market who closed up and left. So at this point, with bank regulation seeming to moderate, given the appointees of at the Fed and the federal banking agencies, I expect the regulatory framework to become much more friendly to banking and international banking particularly, and I think that'll maybe create a resurgence here with some of those that left hopefully coming back. But there's still a very robust international banking community here.